In 1904 we gathered round, athletes strong in every town. In St. Louis the games began, chasing medals hand in hand.
It is now in our hands, and the United States is totally committed to upholding the Olympic Charter and the traditions which this torch represents. As the host nation for the Games, we will fulfill our responsibilities. Athletes and Olympic officials of all countries will find a warm welcome and will be treated equally and without discrimination. And the International Olympic Committee have done everything possible to create a hospitable climate in which all participants will be able to perform to the best of their ability. And I have instructed agencies of the federal government to cooperate fully with Olympic and local officials to ensure the safety of all participants. We consider sport to be one of the finest opportunities for people of all nations to come and to know and to understand each other. And in sport, nothing can match the competition of the Olympics. The Olympics provide the ultimate experience in watching athletes survive and strive through honest effort, fair play, discipline, and determination to reach the top. Athletes know better than anyone that there's more, much more.
Hey there, nice to see ya. I was trying to get this video out around the same time as the Olympics, but as you can tell, the Tammy video was more of an undertaking than I had expected, but I had a fun time catching some of the games. I really enjoy the kayak cross. It felt like something I would have made up as a kid. There's also that insane opening with Gojira that perfectly captures France's tumultuous history with its ruling class. But the games weren't without their own controversies, some founded and unfounded. And today I wanted to go over one of the craziest Olympics ever. Between the insanely tone-deaf displays and a participant being shot up with poison, it was quite the event. So this will be less of a turgid tale of death and more of the wild happenings born from the beginnings of the treasured Olympic Games. I'll be taking you through a guided tour on the first half, and the second half will be more of a twisted tale of the tortoise and hare. Hope you enjoy the train wreck, and I'll be seeing you soon. The sun is bright in the sky and shining down on the 1904 Louisiana Centennial Exhibition. A giant Ferris wheel rises over the tops of the ornate buildings at the World's Fair, taking place alongside the Olympics. No one expected it to be set in the growing town of St. Louis, Missouri. Baron Pierre de Coubertin had been strong-armed into it by the World's Fair coordinator, James Sullivan. The Baron was looking to have it in the premier town of Chicago, but James threatened to overshadow the Olympic Games with his own. The Baron decided it wasn't worth the smoke and changed the location. America had just made a deal with the French, purchasing enough land to almost triple its size. It seemed like a deal just too good to be true. It absolutely was. There'd be a winding line of people, numerous and moving like a tide of ants, in contrast to the great architecture all around them. Sullivan wanted spectacle, and he got it. To questionable ends, as you'll see. It wouldn't be hard to get swept up in it. The sight, sound, smell, and taste of it all. It almost seems like too much. A fairgoer wouldn't know where to start. Luckily, you have me here to direct you. And we'll start with my favorite exhibit, the one dedicated to beautiful Jim Key. Cause you see, Jim happened to be a genius. He could add, subtract, use a cash register, spell with blocks, and even have a little repartee in the political arena. Did I mention that he was a horse? Look at that beautiful bastard. And in one of the few heartwarming moments that we'll have in this video, Dr. William Key was a former slave and self-taught veterinarian who journeyed with Jim to show people that animals are more than brutes to be used, but thinking and feeling similar to us. He'd also show that kindness can be a better teacher than the end of a whip. You can easily draw the parallels to his own life and why this meant something to him. And if the good doctor can make a little scratch along the way, then all for the better. So Jim would nod, shake, and point his head as if answering the questions that Key would ask him, and the crowd would erupt in cheers and amusement. But we can't spend too long here, we got a few more exhibits ahead. And next we're off to the world of tomorrow, the Palace of Electricity. Inside were some of the up-and-coming technologies that were going to revolutionize the world. There'd be grand showings of the invention that probably led you to watching me now, the wireless telephone. It'd be on full display next to another invention that you didn't think would be taking shape, the fax machine. Amazingly, they let the inventors of each, Alexander Graham Bell and Elijah Gray, in the same room. Elijah had made claims he had first invented the telephone and not Bell. I can imagine a ton of stink eyes thrown across the room that day. Next up would be the Palace of Transportation, but I imagine everyone's getting kind of hungry, so let's head off for a bit to eat first. And you can't believe the smorgasbord that's waiting for you.
Everything well ripened, seasoned with the passage of time and the heat of the day. Oh, it was rich, my friends, rich.
Hamburgers and hot dogs would be on the menu, supposedly for the first time ever. Most historians agree that it just got popular there, but wasn't actually invented there. And this would be in between scoops of peanut butter and puff cereal, all washed down with gulps of iced tea and Dr. Pepper. And can't forget dessert. We got that spun sugar that keeps me spun, cotton candy. There's also an ice cream wrapped in a waffle. How quaint. But now that you've eaten your fill and the itis is slowly kicking in, it's probably best if we take the autobus to the next exhibit, almost looking more carriage than car. Speaking of cars, there are a multitude on display at the Palace of Transportation. They all run on different sources like gas, steam, and electricity. And Lee DeForest was even showing off his car radio at the time. And I'd like to think if he'd been around, he'd have his own bumps and Electric street rail cars would offer new solutions for public transportation, and in a truly amazing display, the gigantic balloon of an aircraft known as a dirigible took its first flight in America. You get to watch as it slowly, and I mean very slowly, float around the fairgrounds, swaying gently in the breeze like our amber waves of motherfucking grain. No time for Inui though, we have more exhibits to see. There's the awe-inspiring architecture of the world's Columbian Exposition with its many neoclassical structures. There'd also be the Palace of Fine Art showing off its many elegant pieces, including this elephant made of almonds. Yum! And I get it, you're probably hoping to see a real elephant. Well, guess f***ing what, you sad, ill-informed little sack. We got some elephants. They'd be located in the zoological park with the other animals, situated near the Hien Temple and huge aviary cage. But after catching the Creation Exhibition on the Book of Genesis, the Westinghouse Electric Films, and the Swedish Pavilion, I can imagine we're all getting a bit pooped. There'd be one last exhibit you have to see though. I mean, how could I let you leave without seeing the world's largest organ? Don't worry, that wasn't a setup for anything. And this titanic mess of metal and ivories was built by the Los Angeles Art Organ Company, who incidentally went out of business making this hoss. It was often used in large-scale musical pageants and was included in the opening concert for the fair. But it wouldn't be until 1994 that it would lose its largest organ moniker to MC Hammer for the video Pumps It a Bump. And it looks like we took in a lot today between the exhibits, foods, and rides. Unfortunately, it didn't leave time for the anthropology exhibits. That's okay though, cause tomorrow will be the anthropology days where sets of games will also be included with the exhibits. As visions of exotic lands and interesting people dance in your head after the heaviness of sleep hits your eyes, a sideshow nightmare will be waiting for you when you wake. Ah yes, Anthropology Days. A time to educate yourself on your fellow man, to learn of those ancient and rare traditions that make each culture special in the grand scope of the world, jumping headfirst into the norms outside your own and taking all the subtleties of an unfamiliar life. Just kidding, we're going to a human zoo! Small villages mirroring the native tribes of the Philippines, Central Africa, Mexico, Syria, Turkey, and other countries were set up. The coordinator would say the environment imitated the native habitat of the savages. Off to a good start. Fairgoers would walk around and gawk at these poor people pretending to be doing their normal day-to-day back home. And oh, it gets better. Because not only was this racist Epcot an abysmal display, but the Anthropology Day Games would be a complete flop. It was built on a foundation of failure from the start. Remember that James Sullivan I mentioned earlier? The one having the pissing fit over the Olympics being in Chicago? He was basically famous for funding sporting events and was the head of the fair's Department of Physical Culture, acting more like the so-called Department of Exploitation. Can you guess what it handled? Did you guess marketing? Really saying the quiet part out loud there, bud. James threatened to throw a bigger event than the Olympics, and they backed down. The World's Fair actually being a bigger thing at the time. Baird decided not to show up, having his suspicions that it would be a complete shit show. And my man knows his turds. Sullivan worked with William McGee of the Department of Anthropology, who was trying to test his own theories of a racial hierarchy. He would have the indigenous peoples go against the American participants to ultimately show that if you got paper-colored skin and were born in the good old US of A, then you were just the bee's knees. It was all propaganda. The thing is, the tribes were actually paid to be in the exhibit. They weren't going to be paid to be in the Olympics. They didn't want to do it. They may not have been technologically advanced, but they weren't f***ing idiots. And somehow, through whatever means, James was able to round up enough people to compete, and it was something. The first day would feature many of the classic Olympic events like the shot put, the high jump, and the mile. The officials apparently couldn't organize an empty room, much less a sporting event. And the thing is, when you have a bunch of people from various countries and mixed languages and cultures quickly thrown into a bunch of games with little knowledge of the rules, things are going to go in the shitter. Imagine trying to get a triple hitter when you've never even heard of baseball. The participants thought water polo was ridiculous and it got thrown out, and only 3 competitors showed up to throw the 56-pound weight. When asked about another shot, they said, "Nah, I think I got on the first one." The 100-yard dash was even more laughable when the starting gun went off and most of the participants were still standing at the starting line. And if they managed to get through to the end, they just stopped short of the tape, thinking it more of a barrier than an obstacle to run through. The next day would feature games that Sullivan thought would be more favorable to these undignified primitive peoples. There'd be tree climbing, archery, and mud throwing. Sullivan even failed to understand the difference between a spear and a javelin. One is a big stick for stabbing, the other is a small stick for throwing. But surely, if you can wield a katana, you can surely sink this butter knife. So everyone threw like shit, and McGee watched as his data crumpled before his eyes. The entire event was a wash, but Sullivan refused to eat humble pie. He took the natives' failure to beat the javelin record as an absolute fact that it was a sign of racial inferiority. He had to continue shoving his pseudoscience down the throats of anyone who would listen. And the kicker to all of this is that most of the American participants weren't even American. They're mostly men who had immigrated to America but still weren't citizens. One would be Francis Gailey, who won 4 medals in swimming but was actually an Australian citizen at the time. The Olympic Committee would amend 9 of these winners' nationalities later. And I've had to mention this little bit of good. One of the participants, George Iser, was a gymnast with 1 leg and did pretty well in the games. So that was pretty awesome. And the first all-women's Indian basketball team kicked ass throughout the competition, flying in the face of all of McGee's so-called research. And even though most of these games would be a charade, the marathon would be even more of a fustercluck. This is Thomas Hicks and Felix Carvajal, our titular tortoise and hare. And I'm going to be honest, I'm a bit biased towards Felix, our hare of the story. He was a long-distance runner from Havana, Cuba, who had delivered dispatches during the Spanish-American War, even running the length of Cuba in 16 days. He had managed to raise enough money by running around City Hall, just over and over like a one-man NASCAR. There are rumors that once he had gotten to America, he ended up gambling all of his money over craps in New Orleans while drinking the rest away at bars. He had even showed up to the event in long pants, but one of the other runners let him know he may not want to do this marathon on hard mode and convinced Felix to cut his pants into shorts. You'll see the amount of fucks this man gives. And on the other side, that man with the dog in him, Thomas Hicks. Hicks was a brass worker from Massachusetts, but was originally born in England. He had done American track and field, and he was there to be Kurt and kick dirt. And he wouldn't compare to the guy who would take the whole thing though, Sam Malloy. He had finished top 10 in the Boston Marathon 6 times within 8 years and placed first in 1902. Most instantly had him pegged as the winner, and there'd be a few other racers who would come out of nowhere to blast down the field. The first 2 were Lynn Tagnani and John Masciani, members of the Tswana tribe. They were actually there because of the disaster that was the World's Fair, and had asked to compete in the marathon. They entered to be the first black Africans to compete. And then there was Fred Lors, bricklayer by day, and marathon runner by around midday. So we have our runners lined up at the starting line. It would be 90 degrees with the hard sun beating down and dust being kicked up from the trail. The starting gun would be fired, and the men would get to huffing. Our tortoise would take the lead. As the runners would get further down the field, it would be apparent the directors had absolutely zero engineers design the course, instead picking a track filled with hills that were far more up than down, some with cracked stones, making finding your footing unsure. Like a vaudeville Frogger, the runners would have to dodge traffic on the road, including railroad trains and trolley cars. And most of these would kick up dust into the runners' faces, making sure they get a big whiff. And this is what ultimately did William Garcia in. Because in another fun twist, Sullivan was using his Olympic marathon as testing grounds for experiments on dehydration. He thought that you would do better the more dehydrated you are. We humans, the ones more fluid than meat sack. He'd place a well 12 miles into the 14-mile race and it would be the only source of water. So a combination of having zero water and then inhaling a metric ton of dust would start to shred the lining in his stomach, causing hemorrhaging. He collapsed on the side of the road in labored pain. Luckily, help would arrive and he'd recoup. Soon after that, another runner, Lorden, would start upchucking on the side of the road, the grit getting to him. He said screw it and took off. Felix would be having a different kind of time. He'd be trotting along, making good time as his large white shirt billowed in the wind. He would stop every now and then to talk to the spectators, whether he completely spoke their language or not. He'd also yell and wave his cap whenever the newspaper cars would pass by. And speaking of passing by, Lin-Tao would be making amazing time down the track. This run was nothing compared to what he was used to dealing with. Unfortunately, the path that he was running had wild dogs littered alongside hoping to catch some food while all the hubbub was going on. The dogs then viciously chased Lin-Tao off the track, and soon the race lost another runner. And Thomas would be having a hell of his own time. He'd also have two coaches with him. This is a time when the Olympics had less stringent rules, and the coaches were able to offer a lot more help. To an insane degree, as you'll see later. Around the 10-mile mark, he started begging them for water, already feeling dehydrated. Sweat would be pouring off of him. They swab his mouth with warm water. Refreshing. I'm surprised he just didn't grab the sponge and start squeezing. Felix again would be having a different time. He had stopped to talk to someone in a parked car. He had seen them eating some peaches and he had to have one. With his dust-choked esophagus, those juicy fuzz bags were looking pretty good. They weren't sharing though. Felix, not to be deterred, straight up yoinked a few and then ran off, using the juice and sugars to keep him in the run, laughing the whole way. With Thomas, he was asking for water again. His coaches weren't having it. I mean, they had a secret weapon, Strychnine. Yes, the same stuff they put in rat poison. And when used in small doses, it can be a bit of a stimulant, but when taken in larger doses, leads to muscle convulsions and all sorts of other problems. Thomas downed a concoction of strychnine mixed with egg whites. The egg whites were there just to cut the bitter taste. And as you can tell, there weren't any rules against performance-enhancing drugs. And crazily enough, strychnine was used as recently as the 2016 Olympics. Strychnine was also a popular stimulant at this time. There'd be a bunch of snake oil salesmen trying to grip their drugs before the proper testing was done to show them unsafe. This all happened during the Victorian era and continued on. I could do a whole video on it, just let me know. Easy technology speeding far ahead of any fail-safes to the people's detriment. But our tortoise wouldn't be the only one to dine on a rotten meal. Felix had found an apple orchard, and you can already see where this is going. Felix grabs the apples and stuffs his face, just one apple after another. But then his stomach would start to feel sharp cramps, and he'd double over in pain. The apples were rotten, and so Felix would hit the ground, still holding his stomach and just waiting for the pain to pass. His eyes would close and things would fade to black. Sam Malloy would be doubled over, holding his stomach too. The cramps for the dehydration would be setting in. He would be making the lead, but was severely slowing down, the cramps eventually bringing him to a walk. That walk would come to a stop and Sam decided that he was done. The bricklayer, Fred, had also begun cramping to where he slowed to a crawl, seemingly looking to take advantage of the lax rules. Fred jumped into one of the passing cars. Here, he would play Miss America as he waved and smiled at spectators as they would pass by. This would start to kill the spirit of Thomas, who was already turning ashen white as the strychnine coursed through his veins. Even more so when he saw Fred get out of the car. Fred had just ridden 11 miles and began to trot towards the finish line. The handlers with Thomas weren't having it and yelled for Fred to get his cheating ass off the course. Fred didn't listen. Now fresh from his afternoon jaunt, Fred crashed through the finish tape in a flurry of excitement. The crowd would go into a roar, cheering him on. This wouldn't last long though. Everyone had seen him take the car ride, and that seemed to be the line for this event. So he was booed off the stage and disqualified. Fred said he was having a little joke, not realizing that he was the little joke for wasting everyone's time. He'd redeem himself the following year though in the Boston Marathon, where he would get first place, even beating out the winner of this Olympic marathon. And when Thomas saw Fred disqualified, this kicked in his brutal tortoise tactics, and he was going to fight to reach that finish line. Damn the poison straddling him now. His coaches had one more secret weapon for Thomas. And no, it's not water. Sorry, Thomas. It was brandy, something else that they could dehydrate him with. They would soak his head with a sponge in warm water. This would help invigorate Thomas and he'd be off to a slow crawl. He looked like the Walking Dead. Race official Charles Lucas wrote, "Of the last 2 miles of the road, Hicks was running mechanically, like a well-oiled piece of machinery. His eyes were dull, lusterless. The ashen color of his face was skin and deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiff. The last few miles would be torment." The handlers would continue feeding him egg whites, brandy, and strychnine. This caused Thomas to hallucinate. He thought he had another 20 miles to run. It was too much. He just wanted to lie down and eat something. He told his handlers the same. His coaches continued to egg him on in all the ways. And Thomas would make it to a jog before his body would start to go rigid from the strychnine. The jog would then turn into a listless shuffle. The finish line almost in sight. The St. Louis Dispatch would describe his state perfectly. There was not a semblance of the elastic spring with which he started. He must have heard the uproar about him, but he betrayed no sign of it. He was past that. He did look up once when the din was at its height. He was within a few yards of the finish. His lower jaw was hanging as an imbecility. His eyes stared blankly, and his pitiful expression didn't change. Thomas could barely move his body, but his handlers would not let that stop them. They'd hoist Thomas's arms over their shoulders and carry his turgid body towards the finish line. He'd weigh on them like a sack of potatoes, with his little feetsies just barely kicking underneath him. They'd drag his body over the finish line and Thomas would be declared the winner. His dull eyes caught a slight shine before 4 doctors had come to his rescue, and with their help he'd be able to leave the field. And that's him, the big hero, the winner triumphant, the grand master of runonomics, relegated to a pile on the floor. It's a pretty good analogy for the 1904 Olympics. He completed the race in 2 hours, 28 minutes, and 53 seconds. Thomas required 4 doctors to leave the field. His words on the experience were, "Never in my life have I run such a tough course. The terrible hills simply tear him into pieces." Hopefully, the record he set that day was worth it all. He set the record for the longest time ever recorded by a winner in an Olympic marathon. Feels like a slap in the face after everything else he went through. It's a hell of a story, though. And there you have it, folks, the 1904 Olympics in all its glory hole. As you can tell from the reasoning for these games, it was going to go very bad very quickly. At times when both technology and hopes were high, as opposed to our jaded asses now. But also a time of vast ignorance where dehumanizing someone was seen as a sign of progress. We've grown a lot since then, but in a lot of ways still haven't. And I can't help but feel a creeping sense of dread for the dystopian novel we all seem to be writing ourselves into. And hopefully we can learn from our mistakes. If not, then maybe this ridiculous story of the strychnine sprinter and that beautiful bastard of a horse can make you forget for a few minutes. Otherwise, there's not much more to say besides treat people like people and don't poison anyone. Yeah, that's the takeaway for this one.